Many big buildings. Like I say, I never did anything without a reason. I never, and nor did my people, nor did anyone. Um, Zeppelins were used very, very extensively for about, I would say about 150 years or so, as basically the best way to lift things. So many smaller stones were lifted. They would be hand done on the ground, and then they would be carried in sheets by Zeppelins. Horses could move Zeppelins fairly easily. And they would either be slid along the ground or they'd be lifted up. Later on, Zeppelins were powered, but at first, Zeppelins, there was a lot of horses basically pulling Zeppelins along the ground. The Zeppelin would lift the load, using hydrogen, and it was fairly safe because you didn't really have anybody in the Zeppelin. So if the Zeppelin was struck by lightning or something like that, plus the power would be shifted. Anyway, though, but the Zeppelin could take the weight off something, and then horses could basically just pull it along the ground. This technique was used a lot ever since the invention of power. We had hydrogen, and before that, they actually did use some hot air balloons, but hot air balloons weren't very effective. But very quickly they got hydrogen, and once they got hydrogen, and that's why a lot of these Zeppelins were very important to basically be able to keep them keep them inside of hangars basically, and these hangars were made of stone and actually built with smaller balloons. They would build the small balloons, and then they would use the big dirigibles for the big stuff. But that's why a lot of the bricks, you notice the bricks are about the same size, and that size was based on the amount of the size of the balloon that they would use to lift them up into place, basically. And what they would do is they would basically use a counterweight system or a winch system to basically they would have a mooring stone basically. And then they would lift up these things, and they would use the people to guide them into place. And they would use a winch system. Later on, they used a steam winch or whatever, But basically, people could use a wooden winch to basically winch these things up into place and put them and stack stones fairly easily. And that's how a lot of the cathedrals were actually built. They weren't built using big cranes. They're built using dirigibles, which on most not so windy days, which was fairly easy to do really. But that's why a lot of the stones are about a certain size, and that size was based on the lifting capacity of the hot air or helium or hydrogen. They use hydrogen quite extensively. In fact, a lot of the big cathedrals were built to house the big dirigibles, where the big dirigibles would basically be stuffed in there during high wind conditions. Later on, as steel forges got to be more and more common, and basically land-based cranes, it made the dirigibles not so efficient or not so useful to have around. And they were converted over into churches, as you call them. But they didn't start out being churches. They started out being hangars for dirigibles, and a lot of these hangars originally had there was no roofs. The dirigibles would be winched down into them, and they would but the dirigibles would sometimes get sucked up, which is why the doors became particularly very important to basically be able to seal in, because a suction draft, they'll create a draft. Air coming like this will push up on the Zeppelin, which was a problem. But they had big anchoring stones inside the floor, and they would tie them down so they wouldn't be thrust out of there. Because, of course, hydrogen was fairly hard to make. You took power and electricity, so you could only make so much of it at a time, basically. So that's why a lot of these cathedrals had such high ceilings. They weren't just high ceilings. They were high ceilings for dirigibles, because there's something inside there. So anyway, and that's how all those stones were stacked. They didn't really use, they did use some cranes, but realistically it was, the crane wasn't really doing the work. It was the dirigible would be doing the work, and the crane was only there to basically stabilize the dirigible and keep it from flying away in any kind of wind conditions, which a lot of times, wind is only really there certain times, so you'd basically, work on it when you could, and then not work on it when the wind conditions were bad. Later on, we have what's called cranes and stuff, and cranes become more and more common as we get more and more steel. But back in the days before steel, when there was just catgut and everything else, we had dirigibles. They were everywhere, and they were used very extensively, and they're dirigible people. So, and that's basically your human history. Pretty much that has basically been lost or forgotten about. I don't know why, but the flying buttress. That's basically another word for Zeppelin.